Good afternoon. Thanks to those joining us here in person at the Atlantic Council and also to our online audience. I'm Paula Dobriansky, Vice Chair of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and also an Atlantic Council Board of Directors member. I am very pleased to welcome you to this event, exploring how the United States can succeed against Russia and China to secure supply chains and win the race for advanced technologies. Convenings such as this are integral to facilitating the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. This event is the first in a bipartisan series co-hosted by the Scowcroft Center and the Global China Hub, which aims to engage policymakers on issues related to secure supply chains, technology competition, and related challenges posed by China and Russia. Today, we are very delighted to be joined by the Honorable Michael McCall, lead Republican of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and a United States representative from the great state of Texas, who was an author of the recently passed CHIPS for America Act and has been a leading voice on national security issues involving China. He is also chair of the China Task Force. Congressman McCall, thank you so much for being here. The world is in a new era of great power competition. China and Russia seek to remake the world in their authoritarian image and are willing to take aggressive action toward that end, as can be seen by Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine and China's recent military exercises near Taiwan. Moreover, China in particular is positioning itself to lead in the development of the 21st century technologies. Beijing's increasing capabilities in the technology realm pose significant risks for the United States and its democratic allies and partners. First, it is using its increasingly advanced technological capabilities to develop more sophisticated weapon systems. Second, China's leadership in advanced technologies could help fuel its economic growth and render much of the world dependent on it for critical technologies. And finally, Beijing is also employing new technologies in ways that are inconsistent with democratic norms such as facial recognition technology to assert greater surveillance of its citizens and is exporting these technologies to other autocracies. Moreover, amid the 21st century technology race, the U.S. and its allies have become increasingly reliant on China and Russia across a range of critical sectors. At the same time, China and Russia are using their economic leverage to coerce democracies into giving in to their political demands. The question before us today is how the United States and its allies can better respond to these challenges. Congress, of course, has a vital role to play in shaping that response. And we are so delighted that Congressman Michael McCall is here to discuss this crucial subject matter. The Scowcroft Center recently released 2 reports exploring these issues. Let me share with you. The first report was entitled A Democratic Trade Partnership, Ally Shoring to Counter Coercion and Secure Supply Chains, which proposes a framework for the U.S. and its allies to coordinate against economic challenges posed by revisionist autocracies. And then the second publication, Toward a Democratic Technology Alliance, an innovation edge that favors freedom, which proposes a new body through which democracies can better cooperate to lead on developing advanced technologies and norms consistent with democratic values. We are very grateful to be joined today by Dr. Matthew Koenig, Acting Director of the Scowcroft Center, who will moderate this fireside chat. And again, thank you, Congressman Mike McCall. We really are delighted that you could take the time to be with us. We look forward to an insightful discussion, and thank you all for joining us. Now, over to you, Dr. Koenig.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Paula. It's really a pleasure to be moderating today's event on secure supply chains and the race for advanced technologies. And it's an honor to be here with you, Congressman McCall. Thank you very much for joining us at the Council. So as Paula mentioned, we've been doing some work in this area. We've released a couple of reports on securing supply chains, but you've really been a leader in the U.S. Congress, the author of the CHIPS Act. But this is an issue you've been working on for some time. I was wondering if we could maybe begin by you talking about how you got interested in this issue early in your career.
Yeah, and thanks for asking that question. And Ambassador, thank you for the introduction as well. And it's great to be here, the Atlantic Council, and I appreciate the publications that you, it really helps the policymaker. Yeah, my story goes back to like 1996. I'm a young federal prosecutor at Maine Justice Public Integrity Section, and I was assigned to the Campaign Finance Task Force. The theory was that China was somehow trying to influence our presidential election through putting campaign dollars in the system for a variety of reasons, but primarily dual-use technologies, right? Aerospace, satellite technologies, and they also they were very interested in getting into the WTO. So put it in the historic perspective, you know, at that time, President Clinton, he ran on a pro-Taiwan policy, but then got softened up and realized that the Department of Commerce could actually get the economy going if we start exporting a lot of these technologies to China. And then you fast forward to today, 2022, and I'll talk more about what's happening now. But for me, it was a fascinating case, really a textbook case. I'm not trying to plug my book because it's been out for a while, but Failures of Imagination. Chapter 3 discusses the case. So I got assigned to the case, and I never realized where it would end up. And through good, I think, investigative work by the FBI and others, we got Johnny Chung to plead guilty, and then he started to cooperate with us at that point in time. China would not cooperate with our investigation, but we still couldn't prove the theory. Eventually, through his cooperation, he told this sort of fantastical story that he met with the director of Chinese intelligence and Liu Qiaoying, the executive vice president of China Aerospace, who was the daughter of the most powerful general in China, in a room with a big antenna where they had this discussion. You know, we like your president, we want to see him win, and we want to put money in your Hong Kong bank account to help him. So, but we had to prove this, right? So I was working with then J.J. Smith, and I'll tell you a little bit about him more at the end, but he was the lead foreign counterintelligence guy, supervisory agent in Los Angeles, and one of the leaders in the FBI for China espionage. We brought him into a room. We had 100 photographs of Xi Shenda, who was the director of military intelligence. One was a young photo, one was a very old one. We're just trying to establish that he knows who this guy is because he's not publicly known. He immediately walks in the room and identifies Xi Shenda. So we realize, okay, he's met him, right? Then we were able to get a consent form to get his Hong Kong bank records, and there we found a deposit slip by Liu Qiaoying, member, executive vice president of China Aerospace, into his Hong Kong bank account. And then we followed the money. Now, Chung takes some of that money, pays his mortgage off, which, you know, it's classic. But the rest of it goes into the Clinton campaign. And then we realized, my God, you know, that this actually happened. And next thing I know, the Congress, which I was not a member at that time, wants to have him testify. And so I was, you know, a big part of that. But it really exposed this plan to influence our elections. It's not the first time a foreign nation's tried to do this for reasons of getting more satellite technology. A couple of interesting, and I won't belabor this too long, but there was an individual that was trying to obstruct Chung, telling him not to cooperate. So we put a wire on him, and he started recording these conversations. We put a wiretap up on the individual, and he was calling generals in China reporting back. And he would say things like, don't talk, don't cooperate, we'll give you money. Federal prosecutor, I wrote what's called a prosecution memorandum for indictment on obstruction of justice. And I was told that that was going to be farmed out to the LA U.S. Attorney's Office. And you know, thanks for doing such a great job, and you'll go back to public integrity section. I don't know what happened to that case. Maybe it was an intelligence equity with this individual. But he was never indicted. Meanwhile, through this cooperation, we were getting reports of some fairly dangerous people coming in that were interested in possibly assassinating him. So we had put him under federal protection for many months. After he fully cooperated, he was given a leniency in sentencing. But I think to end the story, one of the most bizarre twists to this whole thing is my FBI foreign counterintelligence agent, J.J. Smith, pled guilty, or not pled guilty, he was indicted for espionage. Why? He was sleeping with a Chinese spy. Not only him, but an FBI agent in San Francisco as well. He had cultivated a woman by the name of Katrina Leon. I don't know if you know Michael Pillsbury, 100-year marathon. We've been very focused on the Katrina Leon story, which we still don't have all the facts. Remember, the wall's up back then between the criminal side and the intelligence side. So I could throw all this over to J.J. Smith. He could share relatively little with me. Everything I was throwing over the wall, though, went straight to his FBI asset of 20 years, by the way, who was operating as a double agent reporting back to Beijing. She did serious damage to the national security of the United States. But this is just a little anecdotal story to show you how they operate on so many levels in terms of trying to influence for satellite technology to how they compromise even members of the FBI. And in fact, JJ took her to FBI White House Christmas parties.
Wow.
And as you know, there's a member of Congress that had the same dilemma.
Well, it's a remarkable story, and I think it goes to show why you're maybe ahead of us in seeing this threat. But if we could bring it up to today, there are many like us in the national security community who see this need to secure supply chains, to selectively decouple from China. I still talk to colleagues in the business community who say, well, we're very dependent on China economically. This is going to be costly for us. So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the threat. Why is there a need to secure supply chains? What's the problem?
Well, China has greatly advanced since this time, and they're very advanced in technology. They've dedicated $1 trillion to their digital, program. That'd be everything technology, semiconductors, AI, quantum computing, 5G. And they've continued down this path. I think COVID, the pandemic, really woke up people to the fact that we were far too dependent on critical supply chains, not all supply chains, but critical that are of national security importance. Medical being the first one. Remember, they hoarded the PPEs knowing that the pandemic was coming. Number two, rare earth minerals. So under their Belt and Road Initiative, it's classic. They have 140 countries now pre-positioned where they go in with World Bank loans, charge a usurious interest rate to a truly developing nation, bankrupt them, bring their own workers in to take the rare earth minerals out, and then typically the IMF will come bail them out, and then they typically get access to a port or a base, like say in Afghanistan today. China's in Afghanistan signing leases as we speak, and true to form, I predict they will get access to Bagram Air Base. That's the awful, devastating result of the Afghan conflict. But how do we get off these supply chains that we're vulnerable, right? Mm-hmm. Just like allowing Putin to build his pipeline to Europe, we don't want to be dependent on, communist China for these critical supply chains. That was the inception of the Chips for America Act that I authored. And I have to say, it wasn't just my idea. I had Secretary Pompeo came to me when I chaired the China Task Force, Secretary Wilbur Ross, National Security Advisor O'Brien. They were taking TSMC out of Taiwan and putting them into Arizona as a little pilot program. But this bill would lead to a much larger effort to bring or keep manufacturing in the United States on such an important national security asset. And to bring trillions of dollars here, not overseas, but most importantly, protecting this key national security asset that's in, quite frankly, everything from your phone, your vehicle, but from my perspective, the most advanced weapon systems have these advanced chips. And that was a generational, transformational bill that if you talk to the intelligence community, said is going to make a big difference in how we confront China.
Well, you are an author of the CHIPS Act. That was going to be my next question, but you've essentially addressed that. I know you've also been a leader on export controls, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's happening there. I mean, it seems like China, we've essentially just been selling China a lot of this advanced technology. You've been calling for stronger export controls. What do we need to do there to protect this critical technology?
So, to understand the mindset, I mean, I always like looking back historically, right? So I first get elected to Congress. Remember, I worked on this case, and I get invited to Bush 41's big reception with Chinese Communist Party officials. And imagine my, when I, give my background, walk into this room, and I'm surrounded by, PLA and the flags, and and I talked to Secretary Baker about this. He said, we really tried to bring them in the family of nations. We wanted them to move forward and be more of a, maybe a democracy. And he said, but it just didn't work. It just didn't work. And back then we gave them a lot, and what we didn't give them, they've stolen. And I can cite all the cases, right? The Houston consulate was shut down for a reason, because they were stealing all this technology from the Texas Medical Center, but also from NASA, again, aerospace. There's a Texas A&M professor who was indicted because he was selling NASA data to, and what they do is they infiltrate our researchers, and they give them a lot of money, and then it's a 1,000 Talents program. They will give the mothership back in China this research and development. Why is export control? It sounds very esoteric, right? What is an export control? Basically, it was set up and it was strengthened under Ed Royce's tenure as chairman, the Export Control Reform Act. Because what we're finding now, it's not everything, but on these critical technologies, we have to stop selling it to them. What's probably the biggest highlighted example of this? The hypersonic missile, the weapon that we saw China launch with great precision, went around the world, and then landed with great precision, that can also carry a nuclear warhead. And it actually caught our military way off guard. We didn't realize they were that advanced. But when you study it, you realize that was actually built on the backbone of American technology, that we sold it to them. So you have this very intricate system called the entities list. So Department of Commerce has a list, Department of Defense has a list. Defense is more interested in security. Commerce, going back to that case, they're more interested in industry. So when you talk to the industry folks, they're probably leaning on Commerce to, hey, be a little more relaxed in your controls. I think we need to harmonize those two. Within Commerce is a little-known office called the Bureau of Industry and Security. My committee has jurisdiction and oversight over them. I think they realize that Congress is now aware they exist and that they do control the exports. I was able to get, for the first time, records dating 6 months back that indicated that less than 1% of the licenses applied for were denied by BIS. But more disturbingly, that $60 billion went directly into Huawei in China, and $40 billion went into SMIC, which is their semiconductor corporation. We got to stop doing this. We're literally aiding and abetting the Chinese war machine that will be turned against Taiwan, and we can talk more about that. We're very concerned about that as we look at Putin and Ukraine and Chairman Xi. After he becomes the imperial president, probably in November, what's going to be his next move? We know, just like Putin, it's not a question of when or if, but when it happens and how they do this. And that's why it's also important.
So my understanding is that you mentioned this tension between Congress and Department of Commerce. My understanding is that Congress passed some legislation asking Commerce to come up with a list of what are the foundational and emerging technologies that we need to control. Have they come up with that list yet?
No.
Where does that stand?
No, I mean, they haven't. And if I'm fortunate enough to become the next chairman, I'm going to implement a 90-day review of this office and what they're doing, because they've never had any real oversight. Find out what are they doing, have them testify, where should they be located? After the Chung case and that whole era, Congress did act, and they prohibited the export of satellite technology to China. And that was one of the first times we saw Congress really flexing its muscle on this. Then it was a little bit relaxed in 2013 for industry reasons. But we really saw that lead to something where we were prohibiting the sale of certain technologies to China. And I think we need to look at outbound investment flows, capital flows, but most importantly, this technology that can be used against us.
So it sounds like we know what the problem is. We've taken some good steps like the CHIPS Act. But taking a step back, is there a kind of whole of government strategy yet? Do we have a strategy for identifying what are the technologies, what are all the tools that we can use to address this, or not yet?
Not yet. And why I say that is the Department of Commerce has the ultimate decision making on this, right? They may get some input from state or DOD, but at the end of the day, their list is more industry friendly, DOD is more security. And it seems to me that we got to take a look. Does that really, maybe it belongs in the State Department? I don't know, but that's something we need to look at. But we also need to ensure that we have these investments in outward capital flows. We really don't have a handle. And there are some bills like Cornyn, Casey out there in the Senate that would help. You would have to report it to the Department of Commerce, and the president could actually, if in the national interest of the United States, stop that outward bound. But again, I think we have a clear picture to industry that, look, there's one entities list, and it incorporates both industry but security as well. And if you invest or send exports to these companies that we have identified are part of the PLA's military, that's going to be denied.
So I want to broaden to talk about allies and partners, because it seems to me that even if the United States has the perfect strategy in place, and it seems like we're not there yet, but even if we did, we're denying the technology to China. They could just go to the European Union or to Japan. So it seems like really a whole of free world strategy might make sense. And that's essentially what we call for in these two new reports. We call for the establishment of a democratic trade partnership, a democratic technology alliance. So do you see, how do you see the role of allies and partners? And do you think some kind of more formal coordinating institutions could be helpful for dealing with this problem on a global scale?
I think it's absolutely essential we work in tandem with our allies, which, by the way, NATO now far more stronger than they were prior to the invasion, achieving the exact opposite of what Putin intended to accomplish, and that's a good news. But in the CHIPS bill, we have a multinational fund really designed at coordinating with our allies, and this is your key point. And this is such a great report, is that is absolutely essential, because if we tell our companies in the United States you can't do this, but then our allies export to China, it doesn't stop the problem. We have to do this in concert with our allies, and I think given the nature of the NATO alliance right now, I think it's very achievable. But it's all got to be done in the name of national security, and they all have to be partners to this. It's kind of like Nord Stream 2. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was leading the charge on sanctions on Nord Stream 2. I didn't understand Germany when I talked to their ambassador. Why do you want to be dependent on Russian energy? And the president waived our sanctions, which we never thought would happen, in the national security interest of the United States, which it wasn't, allowing Europe to be dependent on Russian energy. That's a bad result. And now they regret it. Germany absolutely regrets this. And then they want our LNG to come into Europe. But, it's playing catch up. And the same thing with these exports of technology. I think we really have to be on the same page with our allies on this. Because if we can deny them, China, the technology to make, for instance, these advanced semiconductor chips, which obviously would be used in all their military advanced weapon systems. To me, that's a smart game. And to the businessman who wants to do business in China, that's your risk. I mean, that's your appetite for risk. I will say, and I have a lot of CEOs that come to me now as an expert asking me, I'm not on their board, but they want to know, should I invest? Well, the structure's changed. It has to be 51-49. And they put on the board, they put, a member of the PLA, Communist Party, on your board. And, it may be short-term gain, but long-term it's going to be painful when they steal your intellectual property.
So the advice you give CEOs then essentially is to be wary of doing business in China?
Know that if you do, your IP is probably going to be stolen. And it's a matter of time. But that's the risk they have to weigh as to whether it's worth it. I think you're seeing less and less of that kind of investment. And we've really been lifting up their economy through our investments in China.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the allies and partners, as ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I know you're meeting with allies and partners frequently. Do you think the Europeans, our Indo-Pacific allies, are where we are on this issue, or do we have some work to do to bring them along?
Yeah, I think there's been an awakening, particularly after COVID. We can talk about the origins of COVID, but the way China handled the PPEs, a bit of an awakening that like, there's something not right here. And then they're being very deceiving. I met with a great question about the Pacific Islands. And they were all those countries. There were about 20 of them that, I was with Speaker Pelosi and myself, and we greeted them into the United States Capitol. And they're very important to us. And we're very important to them. But they'll tell you, you liberated us during World War II, and then you kind of forgot about us. And you're seeing, like, for instance, Solomon Islands, right? John Kennedy, PT 109. China signed a security agreement with the Solomon Islands. So now Solomon Islands, that my father's generation liberated, are now under the thumb of the PRC, and that's not a good outcome. We've got to be more engaged with them and show that we care. And that would be economic ties, that would be trade ties, and it also means security alliances in the region. And you got to be on the field, right? If you're not on the field, you can't win. And so we're seeing the Belt and Road, getting back to that, 140 countries around the world in the Indo-Pacific, in Africa. Remember, 20 nations abstained from the UN Security Council resolution on Ukraine because they're essentially owned by China, and they have to denounce Taiwan. And then in Latin America, right in our backyard, they have ports on both sides of the Panama Canal. Imagine if they could shut that down. El Salvador's gone to the Chinese now, and they didn't used to be that way. And we're looking at, we always knew that, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba were satellite nations of Iran and Russia and China. But now you're seeing this phenomena in Brazil and Argentina. So something we really got to wake up to.
Yeah, I think that was one of the surprising things to me, too, after the invasion of Ukraine, that we see the world kind of dividing into these three blocks. I think the free world was more united than I understood. Mm-hmm. I think these revisionist autocracies working together, Russia and China in a partnership with no limits, Russia buying weapons from the Iranians and the North Koreans, and then this kind of new non-aligned movement in the global South not willing to take a stand. That was surprising to me.
Well, in the islands, remember, there are 20, that's 20 votes. I'm an elected official, the votes are kind of important, but if you're in the United Nations and you can get a block of 20 votes. Now, if you've looked at what China, I give them credit. We can't just say they're bad. They're very smart. And they're a worthy adversary. We just have to compete with them. And they've systematically taken over key positions in the United Nations, and they work at it. And they have a lot of staff at the UN. And, they work these positions. They almost took over the intellectual property organization at the United Nations. Can you imagine the number one stealer of IP taking over that organization in the United Nations? And I think had a lot of discussions with Secretary Pompeo about this and the systematic attempt to take over the UN.
All right, I do want to turn to our audience. So if you're watching online, you can ask questions in the chat function using Zoom. I have an iPad here where I can see your questions coming in. And also, for those of you here in our studio audience, if you'd like to ask a question, the best way to do that will be through the iPads that are circulating now. Before I turn to the audience, one last question for you. If we can believe the polls, there's a chance you'll be in the majority after the elections. You're ranking member of House Foreign Affairs. Now, if you become chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, what would be some of your priorities as it relates to these issues in the new term?
So when I chaired Homeland Security, my focus was Al-Qaeda and the rise of ISIS and the Caliphate. And that was the number one threat to the homeland back then, and cybersecurity. I stood up the CISO within DHS. Now the threat has shifted. Not to say that that isn't still a problem, particularly now in Afghanistan when you see the Taliban harboring Zawahiri. But the bigger threat are the rise of these foreign nation state adversaries. And that's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And to your point, there is this divide now you're seeing play out. It's almost like when Putin invaded, largest invasion in Europe since World War II, my dad's war, what Xi's doing in the Pacific, Chairman Xi, it's almost like they're trying to rewrite the map to my father's generation help liberate. And that will require an enormous amount of engagement and oversight with the administration. When I can work with them on Ukraine, I do. When we get the weapons in and we give them to the Ukrainians, they can win this fight, which has been really inspiring. And the same thing with China. We got to be very smart. I had a tabletop exercise with the Pentagon in a classified space, and it's a frightening scenario that would escalate at a very high level very quickly. I think I will be investigating the Afghanistan debacle and what happened, so it never happens again. And I think these export controls, if you really look at that, we have to take a hard look at this tool that we have to stop. And look, I live in Austin. I have all these tech companies, and they love me for the CHIPS bill. I don't know if they're going to love me so much for export control, but I'm doing it to protect the country and our allies, and it's in our national security best interest.
Well, it sounds like you'll have a busy agenda either way. Let me turn to the audience, and first question I see here is, how do you communicate with businesses, and how do you convince them to stop selling to China?
Well, and I do. And I think anytime as a legislator, you have to get buy-in from your stakeholders, and you have to interact with the private sector. If you don't, it's to your own peril. If I don't engage with them on, say, outward bound capital flows, right? I mean, I was with Mnuchin at this Milken Institute event, and he said, your export controls is a heck of a lot easier than outbound capital flows, because you can see the line between the export technologies that are going, say, into China aerospace versus capital flows that may go to the PLA, but everything's controlled by the state. So it's kind of fungible. And I think that's a little more of a challenge, moving forward. But I think it's absolutely critical to have that relationship, because industry knows a lot of things that the government may not know. But at the end of the day, you appeal to their best interest. Is this going to be a good business investment for you? And that has to be their call. I can outline the dangers of it and the fact they won't own a majority of the voting bloc. I can warn them that there will be a member of the PLA on their board, and that they probably, most likely, will steal their intellectual property. That's almost a given. And so they have to weigh that. But I do want their input on the technology stuff. For instance, on chips, advanced semiconductor versus legacy chips. Now, some would argue that all chips, but the fact is China has been manufacturing legacy for quite some time. So we put guardrails up, working with the private sector, that said, okay, if you take the grant money or enjoy the tax incentives, you cannot invest or build a fabrication plant in China for advanced semiconductor manufacturing purposes. And this has actually worked effectively. We're seeing a lot of companies starting to pull back on what they normally would have gone forward on, knowing that the incentives are more important to them than doing business there on a national security asset.
So you mentioned outbound investment. Let me follow up on that, because I think a lot of people may not be familiar with that tool. So we have export controls to prevent technology from going to China. We have foreign investment screening to screen investment from China coming into the United States. This outbound investment idea would essentially prohibit or screen technology coming from the United States or going from the United States into China. Could you talk a little bit about the need for that, and where are we right now, either in the administration or in Congress? Are we close to getting some action on this?
Right. So this would be, any investments in China that are of critical, national security importance. So we have to first identify the entities list and let the private sector know if you invest, say in this company, it's going to go into the PLA's military apparatus. So we stop that from happening. So we put the guardrails. Corning Casey's bill out there. The White House is getting ready to issue an executive order on this that would essentially say, look, anytime you do a major investment to these, what we consider to be national security risk entities, it has to be reported to the Department of Commerce, and I would say the State Department, DOD as well. We need to integrate those three. And then the president would have the ability to, under the EEO, the executive order, the president could prohibit that in the interest of national security.
That makes sense. And I was talking with an allied official recently who didn't quite understand, and essentially the way I put it was, what we have now is Wall Street investing in Chinese technology companies that are helping the PLA build weapons to kill Americans. And does that really make sense? And I would argue it does not.
You put it far better than I have, but that's exactly what's happening. And why is China exempt from Sarbanes-Oxley, by the way? Why aren't they subjected to the same rules and regulations that our companies are in the United States? I think they're going to build the Shanghai Stock Exchange. We're seeing the digital yuan on the rise, so all these 140 countries have to agree to denounce Taiwan and get on the digital yuan. So I think the global currency of the U.S. dollar is always going to be superior for now, but we have to keep an eye on this digital yuan, because if it's in 140 countries, it becomes more competitive, but it also gives them the ability to evade SWIFT sanctions because it's not part of the global dollar currency.
Yeah, it's an important issue, and Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council is hosting this event, but we have a geoeconomics center that's been doing a lot of work on the digital yuan and has a digital currency tracker, so that is an important issue. We have a number of questions coming in from the audience now. Next one says, you spoke about the Department of Commerce. Have you and your colleagues on House Foreign Affairs Committee gotten interest from the agency's leadership when you've raised your concerns?
I have to say, I met with the new director of the Bureau of Industry and Security. He's got a Department of Defense background. But I think for too long they've been ignored, probably to their delight by Congress, because they don't want to be on the radar. But they will be on the radar. And I'm going to be looking under the hood of the car. What's going on in this relatively unknown agency that has such an important role? And I will say that Secretary Raimondo was extremely helpful in the process of the CHIPS for America Act, getting it passed. In fact, the original Competes Act, if you will, had all of this stuff. It's like a Christmas tree, and they put so many bad ornaments, and you're trying to take the ornaments off. And one time she said, why can't we just pass your bill? I said, that'd be great. And we were able to strip it down almost to just that. And she came to a bipartisan classified briefing, and I stood up and gave the pitch why it was urgency. It was a Sputnik moment, I called it, and why it was so urgent. And I have to say, she was impressive and collaborated very well. And she also understood the importance of guardrails so that these companies benefiting cannot do the same thing in China, at the expense of the United States taxpayer. And I'll be working with her to implement the CHIPS Act.
That sounds great. And there's people say Congress is polarized. We can't get anything done. But I think CHIPS Act is a good example where there was a bipartisan consensus on an important issue, and both sides were able to.
I was proud of that. You can't get anything done if you're not willing to be bipartisan, work across the aisle. Doris Matsu is a great partner in the House. Senator Mark Warner. and John Cornyn, in the Senate. It was a bicameral, bipartisan bill that people rallied behind. And that's one of those rare moments in Washington where the system actually is working. And I do think it's going to have a legacy impact on it's a generational issue.
So we have a question here on friend shoring. So we're talking about friend shoring, about ally shoring, but it says the Inflation Reduction Act essentially discriminates against electric vehicles from the EU, Japan, and so on. Is there a contradiction here?
Well, I've got Elon Musk in my hometown, so look, whenever you kind of pick winners and losers, and what my conversation on the electric vehicles that I had with the Musk team was the batteries themselves. Do you understand where you're buying these batteries from? Yeah, from China. But do you understand how they're made? No, not really. Well, basically, off the backs of the Uyghur Muslims they use slave labor to make these batteries and are committing genocide. And this goes back to the rare earth mineral issue, right? Lithium. What's in Afghanistan? $1 trillion of lithium that now the Chinese are going to exploit. And it's all around the world. But why can't you manufacture these batteries in the United States? And guess what? That's what they're doing now. In my district, so I got a little benefit from that, but they're a massive battery manufacturing plant that will go into SpaceX and Starlink, which we've seen how effective in Ukraine, now Iran, that's going to be. And that's what you want. But what we also need to do is work with allied countries to get the rare earth minerals. We can do some of that in the United States, but there's so many restrictions here. There is a facility in Texas, in my district, in Round Rock. They haven't, or Round Top, I should say. They haven't started it yet, the production. And there's one in California. Canada is working on this. And I do think we have an ability to partner with some key allies that we want to keep on our team in both South America, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific.
So you mentioned rare earth minerals as one of the critical supply chains we need to secure. Earlier, you talked about PPE. So we've done a CHIPS Act. Do we need a Rare Earth Minerals Act and a PPE Act, or what's next?
I mean, that was the thinking when I had these preliminary discussions about it. We thought semiconductors was the most critical. I would like to see that apply. Now, I get allegations it's industrial-based economics. But when you're dealing with such a national security asset, I don't think we can afford to do otherwise. And so I would like to see a CHIPS-like bill for the other infrastructures. It just really depends on the will of Congress that they're willing to do that again. I'm glad we got the CHIPS bill done. It was not easy in the home stretch, but I'm the eternal optimist. If we don't secure these supply chains, we're going to be vulnerable to China. And I worry about that, not for me, but my children. And the next generation, what are we handing down to them? Like my father handed down a better America after World War II. What are we going to hand down to them?
So you've talked about the military applications of chips and other things. We have a question here of, is there a role for our military services in securing supply chains? Or I guess Department of Defense more broadly?
Well, right. So if you tried to buy a car recently, it's not easy. It's chips. Same thing with weapons supply. So I sign off on all foreign military weapon sales. There are four of us, the chair ranking on House Foreign Affairs and Senate Foreign Relations, the four of us. I signed off on weapon systems to Taiwan 3 years ago that have yet to go in country, that we're still waiting. We've got a real problem with our defense industrial base and its capability to manufacture these weapon systems. As the eastern flank of NATO has put a lot of their Russian-made stuff into Ukraine, we are trying to backfill them and also backfill our own stockpile in the United States. And a good example of like these smart weapon systems that are really helping Ukraine win this fight, like the Switchblade 600 is a one-way ticket drone with a Javelin warhead, but it needs a chip from Intel. And they've had a hard time manufacturing these because they can't get enough of these chips. So it is integrated. I'm telling you, our defense industrial base is a real issue right now. And that's one other thing I'm working on very intensely with hopefully the incoming chair of Armed Services Committee and House Intelligence, that being Mike Rogers and Mike Turner. How can we fix this? Because it's broken right now, and that creates a very dangerous scenario.
Well, you just asked the question. Let me put it back to you. How do we fix the defense industrial base?
It's complicated. It's the procurement process. It's too much bureaucracy at DOD and state. I blame Congress for some of this too, to be fair. And I think the defense contractors, I mean, they have to be innovative and they have to be more agile. But the Department of Defense has to have the vision, like this book, Failures of Imagination. What keeps you up at night? I had 8 scenarios, but they've got to think creatively about what are going to be the next threats on the horizon that we have to start procuring those weapon systems. I don't think they thought we'd be manufacturing Stingers and Javelins again. That was more kind of Mujahideen type stuff. And now we've almost depleted our entire stockpile.
Okay, I think we might have time for one more question before we wrap up. And there are a lot of good questions here. My apologies to the audience if I don't get to your questions. Well, people watching at home, this might be a good one to end on. They talk about the risks of outbound investment and a bill that would require reporting on that. Is there a way for ordinary investors to know about the risks? Is that something that they should be worrying about, or is this just for big institutional investors? What's the message to the average person that might have some?
It's a great question. I think we should make this as publicly available as possible, so that you as an investor know what you're investing in. We had the thrift savings plan, right? It's like our it's our 401k. And some of these investments were going into PLA investments. Well, we stopped that. We stopped that from happening. And I think a lot of people, I still think a lot of the American people are still patriotic. They really believe in this country, and they know what the threats are. And I think if they knew, or at least we were able to tell them, hey, you may want to rethink this because you're investing in, the Chinese military apparatus, they would probably not want to do that. And so I think making that information more publicly available. And now, of course, in some of these outbound capital investment bills we're looking at, it would have automatic notification.
So we require food manufacturers to list nutrition information. So maybe same thing. We should require financial services to let people know where their money's going.
Right, and this goes back to the role of Defense Department, State, Department of Commerce. They have to collaborate together and not just have one that's very pro-industry and one's very pro-security, but come together and give us an entities list that makes sense, right?
So I think we're about out of time. Is any final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with?
I'd just like to thank the Atlantic Council and the Scowcroft Center for your focus on this issue. At times it's a dry area, but I think as you put it really well about Wall Street, if people realize the threat environment as I get briefed on it, and then realize what we're actually doing, most people don't know that we're exporting technologies or helping China build things like the hypersonic weapons. I think once they understood that, they'd want that to stop to better protect the country. And I feel like I've come full circle in my life, going back to 1996, when I really saw it firsthand. And I was a lot younger, and it really woke me up, and it got my attention. And now I feel like they've accelerated so far now than they were back then at such a more rapid pace. And their AI, quantum, 5G, all this is very advanced. But I'm in a position where I can, like I was when I was a prosecutor, I can now do something about it on the policy side.
Well, I think you're right. The stakes couldn't be higher. The United States has essentially been the world's technology leader since the time of Thomas Edison. Mm-hmm. That's brought us economic, military, geopolitical advantages. And now we're in a race with China. China may be ahead of us in certain areas, and so making sure we're promoting our own innovation and protecting against Chinese technological theft, I think is so important. So really want to thank you for the great work you and your colleagues are doing on Capitol Hill to address this issue.
And that's why I say Sputnik moment, right? I kind of view the parallels to the space race. We got to be all in, and we have to invest in our technology capabilities as well. So, Matt, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks very much, Congressman McCall, for joining us, and we'll look forward to the good work you continue to do on the Hill. And want to thank all of our audience for joining us. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate you spending it with us this afternoon. So continue to look to the Scowcroft Center and to the Atlantic Council for continued work in this important area. Thank you.